Hello, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. Wishing everyone a pleasant listening experience. Today, the book I'm interpreting for you is Saudi, Inc., with the subtitle, The Rise of Saudi Arabia and the IPO of Saudi Aramco. This book delves into the intertwined history of Saudi Aramco and the Saudi Arabian nation. Do you know which company in the world makes the most money? It's not Apple or Google, it's Saudi Aramco, the national oil company of Saudi Arabia. According to Saudi Aramco's 2022 financial report, it reported a net profit of $161.1 billion for the year, marking a 46.5% increase compared to 2021 and setting a historic record for the highest profits ever recorded by a global energy company. Its earnings far surpass those of global tech giants. In terms of 2022 performance, Saudi Aramco's net profit is 1.6 times that of Apple and more than 2.2 times that of Microsoft. So, how does Saudi Aramco make its money? As an oil company, oil naturally plays the largest role. As of 2018, it was the world's largest proven oil reserves holder, boasting the world's largest onshore oil field, Ghawar, and the largest offshore oil field, Safaniya. Saudi Aramco's proven oil reserves are 5 times the total of the top 5 international oil companies. Furthermore, Saudi Aramco's business spans the entire oil industry value chain, including desalination technology, petroleum marketing, plastic products, and lubricant research and development. Its business presence extends globally, with refineries in countries like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, as well as partnerships in many regions worldwide. In this book, author Ellen R. Wald, a Ph.D. in history from Boston University, provides a retrospective of Saudi Aramco's development history. Saudi Aramco began as an American company extracting oil in Saudi Arabia and was initially known as the Arabian American Oil Company, abbreviated as Aramco. After nearly a century of evolution, it is now a wholly Saudi Arabian company and officially changed its name to Saudi Arabian Oil Company, commonly referred to as Saudi Aramco, in 1988. The growth of Saudi Aramco mirrors the development of the nation of Saudi Arabia. As one U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia once said, a strong Saudi Aramco translates to a strong Saudi Arabia. The author, Ellen R. Wald, is not only a history Ph.D. from Boston University but also an expert consultant in geopolitics and the global energy industry. She understands the historical dynamics and policy changes in the Middle East and the development context and power struggles in the world of oil. To write this book, the author conducted extensive interviews, including with former Saudi oil and mining ministers and the vice president of Saudi Aramco, gathering invaluable first-hand information. The book outlines 3 crucial time periods in Saudi Aramco's development, 1933, 1950, and 1980. In 1933, the precursor of Saudi Aramco, Aramco, secured a concession agreement to extract oil, marking the beginning of this grand historical journey. In 1950, the Saudi government proposed a 50-50 profit-sharing arrangement with Aramco, a pivotal move that altered the status quo of oil-exporting nations. Finally, in 1980, the Saudi government gained full ownership of Aramco, marking a triumphant moment for Saudi Arabia. When interpreting this book, we will explore these 3 time periods and the domestic and international context of each, offering insights both vertically and horizontally. Specifically, this history can be divided into 3 periods: the honeymoon period, the period of interest disputes, and the period of independent development. Let's begin with the first time period, the honeymoon period. During this time, American oil companies discovered oil in Saudi Arabia and obtained concessions for its extraction. Saudi Arabia, in pursuit of this business opportunity, was willing to risk offending allies and cozying up to the United States. The story starts with the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia. In 1932, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the 10th-generation leader of the Saudi family, succeeded in consolidating control over the entire Arabian Peninsula after 30 years of continuous warfare. He declared himself king and named the newly formed nation Saudi Arabia after his own family name. In its early days, Saudi Arabia could be described as dirt poor. The country lacked modern infrastructure such as water supply, electricity, roads, railways, and had little economic capacity. The nation's income primarily came from 2 sources, taxing its subjects and collecting fees from pilgrims traveling to Mecca. However, Saudi Arabia's hardships did not last long. In the founding year, oil businessmen approached the king to negotiate for oil concession rights. Representing the United States, it was executives from the California Standard Oil Company who came knocking. Why did American oil businessmen venture here? There were at least 3 reasons. First, after World War I, nations worldwide recognized the significance of oil. Oil and internal combustion engines had transformed the nature of warfare, shifting from battles among men to battles between men and machines. Petroleum-powered internal combustion engines were deployed in various aspects of warfare. For instance, during World War I, the British Army alone deployed 56,000 trucks, 32,000 cars, 34,000 motorcycles, and motorized bicycles. Second, the attention of countries like Britain and France was focused on the Mesopotamian region. In the early 20th century, the British were the first to discover oil in Iran, which was part of the Mesopotamian region, and subsequently became the dominant player in the region's oil industry. After World War I, the British, French, Dutch, and several American companies divided another oil-rich nation, Iraq. The oil reserves in the Mesopotamian region were more than sufficient for the British to exploit. While the British had also explored the Arabian Peninsula, the experts sent there had reported that there was no prospect of oil extraction in the region. Third, the American company, California Standard Oil, was eager to enter the oil industry. They had no opportunity to participate in oil extraction in the Mesopotamian region. Consequently, they turned their attention to the Arabian Peninsula, which had been overlooked by countries like Britain and France. In 1928, California Standard Oil signed a concession agreement for oil exploration with the island nation of Bahrain, located near the Arabian Peninsula. Bahrain was an island nation near the Arabian Peninsula. In 1930, during the first drilling in Bahrain, California Standard Oil struck oil. This initial success allowed California Standard to enter the Middle East oil industry and fueled their appetite for more opportunities. They realized that the terrain in Saudi Arabia, which had just announced its formation as a nation, was similar to the oil-producing areas in Bahrain. As a result, they inferred that Saudi Arabia held substantial oil resources. At that time, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was struggling financially and desperately needed funds. Although King Abdulaziz had little belief that Americans could actually find oil beneath Saudi Arabia's soil, he was pleased to let them try, mainly because the concession agreement promised a substantial sum of money. According to the final version of the contract, the Saudi side would receive an immediate payment of £35,000, followed by an additional £20,000 in 18 months. Furthermore, California Standard Oil Company would pay Saudi Arabia an annual rental fee of £5,000. If the company did indeed discover oil, an additional £50,000 would be paid immediately, followed by another £50,000 a year later. In addition, Saudi Arabia would enjoy a share of the royalties from all oil sales. Both parties agreed, and on May 29, 1933, California Standard secured a 60-year oil extraction concession in the eastern region of Saudi Arabia, covering a vast desert area of 930,000 square kilometers. In the same year, California Standard established a wholly owned subsidiary in the Hassa region, named Arabian American Oil Company, which later became known as Aramco. In 1936, another American company, Texaco, acquired a 50% stake in Aramco, giving Aramco 2 parent companies. However, finding oil wasn't as easy as it seemed. Just the construction of the necessary infrastructure for drilling took Aramco 18 months. Over the next 5 years, they spent millions of dollars and drilled 7 wells. 2 of them produced no oil at all, and the remaining 5 did not yield enough for commercial production. The oil extracted had impurities, high sulfur content, and low production rates. The company's management eventually believed the earlier reports from the British experts that there were no commercially viable oil resources in Saudi Arabia. Consequently, they decided to stop drilling new oil wells. However, the exploration work on well number 7 continued, and the turning point came suddenly. In March 1938, they drilled another 60 meters into well number 7, and oil emerged. On the first day, well number 7 produced over 1,500 barrels of oil. 3 days later, this number increased to nearly 4,000. By 1940, Aramco was producing 20,000 barrels of oil per day. Furthermore, the success of well number 7 led the company to discover another vast oil field nearby. However, the good times were short-lived as World War II erupted. Both the Allied and Axis powers targeted each other's oil wells, refineries, and oil tankers. In 1940, Italian dictator Mussolini sent bombers from Greece to bomb oil refineries in the Persian Gulf. In the face of this dire situation, Aramco decided to withdraw the majority of its American personnel from Saudi Arabia and completely halt oil production. When the war ended in 1945, Aramco immediately decided to restart its oil projects in Saudi Arabia. However, the restart required a significant amount of funding that Aramco's two major shareholders alone couldn't afford. So, two more companies were brought in, New Jersey Standard Oil and New York Standard Oil. These four companies became Aramco's four major shareholders. After the war, the Western European economy rapidly recovered, and the global number of automobiles surged, leading to a high demand for oil. In 1947, Aramco quickly increased Saudi Arabia's oil production to 200,000 barrels per day. With the surge in oil production, the Saudi government's income also skyrocketed. In just 1 year, in 1946, the Saudi government received up to $10 million in royalty fees from Aramco. With the oil revenue in hand, the Saudi government embarked on massive construction projects. They built luxury palaces, developed public infrastructure, constructed roads, railways, airports, hospitals, schools, hotels, and more. Modern buildings sprang up overnight. More money was invested in the oil industry itself. Saudi Arabia built a Trans-Arabian oil pipeline over 1,700 kilometers long, allowing oil to be transported directly to ports along the Mediterranean coast. Aramco also used a portion of its profits for infrastructure development. They constructed roads, ports, airports, company headquarters, residential areas, and more near the oil fields. During this time, it was a honeymoon period between the Saudi government and Aramco. One of the most significant events occurred in November 1947. At that time, the United Nations passed the proposal for the establishment of a Jewish state, leading to increased tensions in the region. The United States was concerned that its support for a Jewish state might affect Aramco's business in Saudi Arabia. However, Saudi King Abdulaziz assured the Americans that he would not allow this conflict to impact Aramco or oil production. The Saudi king's actions can be understood easily. At that time, Saudi Arabia was receiving approximately $15 million in income annually from Aramco. The Saudi government spent lavishly and often had a deficit budget. When Aramco's money arrived, they spent it all. Sometimes, even before the money arrived, they had already spent it, accumulating significant debts. A typical case was with the American construction company Bechtel, which built infrastructure and luxury palaces for Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government owed Bechtel a substantial sum of money. Bechtel had come to Saudi Arabia along with Aramco to build infrastructure. As a result, Bechtel naturally became the designated contractor for the Saudi government. Saudi Arabia was in dire need, lacking technical expertise, equipment, and talent, relying heavily on Bechtel for manpower, equipment, and supplies. The Saudi government's construction projects were massive, resulting in a substantial debt owed to Bechtel. For this reason, Bechtel even sought assistance from the U.S. government and Export-Import Bank to secure a special approval of $15 million for debt repayment by the Saudi government. However, Bechtel, Aramco, and even the U.S. government believed that Saudi Arabia was a country lacking any administrative control or processes and did not have the capability to manage its wealth. The Saudi government, intentionally or unintentionally, used this misunderstanding to its advantage, making the world believe that they were extravagant. However, as Steve Bechtel, CEO of Bechtel Corporation, later summarized, the Saudis were much shrewder than imagined. The Saudi government was well aware of its lack of resources compared to developed countries, such as a large population, educated talent, capital, credit, and local businesses. Simultaneously, they knew that their abundant oil resources were a coveted asset. All they had to do was make good use of it to attract what they lacked. When they had accumulated enough, they could dismiss outsiders with ease. In 1947, Saudi Arabia successfully attracted Bechtel Corporation with a plethora of infrastructure projects that allowed Bechtel to front a significant amount of money on Saudi Arabia's behalf and provide equipment and construction projects. However, by 1951, Bechtel's importance had dwindled. Major Saudi cities were now electrified, transportation networks were in place, hospitals, hotels, and even coffee shops were abundant. Moreover, Saudi Arabia had accumulated the equipment, plans, and logistical reserves for further expansion. The money paid to Bechtel earlier was akin to purchasing equipment, which was then leased to other companies, and at a cheaper rate. Signed contracts could be terminated, and competition could be introduced at any time. With this in mind, when Bechtel occasionally played the emotional card or took a hardline stance to request repayment from the Saudi government had already signed a new contract with another American construction company, Bechtel Corporation. In the end, Bechtel did not reclaim the full amount owed, and the specific amount was not disclosed, but it was certainly significantly lower than the amount stipulated in the contract between Bechtel and the Saudi government. This confrontation between the Saudi government and Bechtel company set the stage for everything that would happen later. The core philosophy of the Saudi government was to buy what they didn't have from the outside and then make it their own. As the Saudis foresaw, no one could resist the temptation of oil. Aramco didn't want to jeopardize its good working relationship with the host country, and no one came to Bechtel's defense. Bechtel left the scene with a sense of defeat. Both Aramco and the U.S. government kindly reminded the Saudi government to be mindful of its financial situation and not rush to spend money that had not yet been received. Aramco did not anticipate that the Saudis had already begun calculating their share of the profits, entering into the second phase, the period of profit sharing. Naturally, the Saudi government did not heed the advice of the Americans, and their budget deficit continued to multiply. Aramco's executives firmly believed that the Saudi side was both immature and lacking in strategy. They were concerned that the King of Saudi Arabia's extravagant spending would lead to insurmountable debts, potentially destabilizing the royal regime and consequently affecting Aramco's business. Therefore, they further advised the Saudi royal family to limit their consumption and delay large-scale project construction. At that time, the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Searles, even brought in a monetary expert to meet with Saudi Finance Minister Suleiman, initiating preparations for financial reform suggestions. On the surface, the Saudi government spoke words that appeased the Americans, hoping to temporarily placate them. For example, when listening to the expert's analysis, Finance Minister Suleiman stated that Saudi Arabia welcomed the assistance of American experts and that he would immediately report these suggestions to the king, requesting the king's consideration and implementation. However, on the other hand, the Saudi government actively sought Aramco's assistance in obtaining more loans from the Export-Import Bank of the United States, ostensibly to alleviate the Saudi government's fiscal deficit. In reality, the Americans never truly understood the reasons behind the Saudi government's extravagant spending. The king needed to act generously to maintain his and his family's rule in Saudi Arabia. Arab culture has a culture of charity. The king needed to meet directly with the common people regularly, listen to their grievances, and provide money to solve their problems. Now, the king had already provided hospitals, schools, sanitation facilities, medical services, transportation facilities, and more for his subjects. This was the best opportunity to solidify the dynasty's rule. If spending were reduced at this point, it could likely lead to rebellion and dissatisfaction, putting the king's rule in real jeopardy. Not only did the Saudis believe that they had no reason to tighten their belts, but they also felt that Aramco had acquired enormous wealth by selling Saudi oil resources, and they were not getting their fair share. The Saudis conducted investigations into Aramco's tax returns and other information, gaining a comprehensive understanding of Aramco's total profits. They found that in the entire year of 1949, Aramco generated a profit of $115 million, for which they had to pay $43 million in taxes to the U.S. Treasury. However, as an oil-exporting country, the Saudi government received only a meager $39 million, even less than what Aramco paid in taxes to the U.S. government. Therefore, by the end of May 1950, the Saudi government officially challenged this situation, using tactics similar to those employed against Bechtel. Initially, the Saudi government did not make regular monthly repayments to Aramco for the railway construction loan. They later announced that they would split the oil profits with Aramco evenly, a 50-50 split. The Saudi government made these demands not without leverage. Several significant events were happening with oil-exporting countries at that time. First, Mexico had nationalized its oil industry. Before World War I, Mexico was the second-largest oil-producing country globally, with an annual production of up to 193 million barrels. In 1934, Mexican nationalist Cardenas became president and signed the expropriation decree, seizing all foreign oil company assets in the country. This event sounded an alarm for all oil-purchasing countries. Second, Venezuela successfully implemented a 50-50 profit-sharing system. In 1943, Venezuela enacted a new petroleum law confirming the principle of an even 50-50 split and additionally required practical use fees from oil companies. Venezuela's move completely changed the previous model where oil companies took the lion's share while oil-producing countries received only a small portion. Third, Iran had been in conflict with Britain, demanding a larger share of the profits. After World War II, Iran witnessed a series of oil protests. In early 1950, Iran's radical nationalist leader Mossadegh and his supporters came to power, initiating the movement for the nationalization of Iran's oil. Fourth, in June 1950, the Korean War erupted, and the Soviet Union was to some extent involved in this conflict. The U.S. government attached great importance to the Soviet Union's strategic advances in non-traditional interest areas like Asia, the Middle East, and so on. For this reason, it urged major American oil companies in the Middle East to sacrifice some profit shares to ensure that their host countries were not infiltrated by Soviet influences. These events underscored a fundamental truth: whoever owned the oil held the upper hand. They also reminded Aramco and the U.S. government that if they didn't negotiate with oil-exporting countries properly, things could spiral out of control. Aramco eventually made concessions. In December 1950, Saudi Arabia achieved its first significant victory by successfully implementing a 50-50 profit-sharing arrangement. Starting from 1951, Aramco had to transfer 50% of its annual export profits to the Saudi authorities. According to statistics, in the entire year of 1951, the Saudi government received a profit share of $110 million from Aramco. However, Aramco did not actually suffer a loss because at that time, the U.S. government agreed to provide tax exemptions to Aramco under the foreign tax credit regulations. The extra payment to Saudi Arabia offset the taxes Aramco paid to the U.S. government. Giving a little to get a little, after this incident, the Saudi king proactively invited Aramco executives to the palace and reassured them, saying, "I hope you and Aramco will stay here forever, working together with us to create our wealth and prosperity." The Saudi king did not want to turn against the Americans. It was in Saudi Arabia's own interest. Almost all of Aramco's revenue came from taxes. Any interruption in the oil industry would mean a loss of national income. At that time, Saudi Arabia neither had enough talent to take over Aramco nor could they bring in another company as they did with Bechtel. Unlike construction companies, among other oil companies unrelated to Aramco's business, only a few had the capability to develop operations in distant Saudi Arabia. These companies were primarily European, and attracting them to take over Aramco was challenging, especially if the Americans refused to buy Saudi oil due to a breakdown in cooperation, which would lead to even greater losses. The king's proactive measures were aimed at ensuring the Americans stayed on course. Aramco's executives were indeed misled, thinking that with the king's assurance, the dispute had ended, and they could continue their business as usual. Little did they know that Saudi Arabia's ambitions for greater control had only just begun. Having half of the profits wasn't enough. Saudi Arabia wanted ownership stakes in Aramco, even the entire company. Everything was pointing in this direction. In 1951, Saudi Finance Minister Suleiman tactfully informed Aramco's board members that wealthy Saudi businessmen and even the Crown Prince were interested in buying shares of the company. Aramco's board members scoffed at this suggestion, ignoring it completely. One vice president, Oliphant, mocked by saying that Aramco would gladly hand over the company tomorrow as long as the Saudi government could bear the $150 million annual operating costs. As a result, by 1968, Saudi oil minister Yamani publicly declared that Saudi Arabia hoped to acquire 50% of Aramco's shares. However, at this point, the Americans abandoned their dismissive attitude from 1951 and gradually sold shares of Aramco in 1972, 1974, and 1976. It wasn't until March 9, 1980, that the Saudi government completed the full acquisition of Aramco. The company transformed from Aramco into Saudi Aramco, shifting from a U.S.-owned corporation to the property of the Saudi king. Why did Aramco's attitude change so dramatically? Why were the Americans willing to relinquish such a lucrative asset? Many years later, all parties involved still remain tight-lipped about their motives and negotiation details. Through the author's analysis, combined with the historical context, I attempt to interpret this from both internal and external perspectives. Let's begin with the external factors. The international landscape was undergoing significant changes, and Aramco was finding it increasingly challenging to sustain its operations. This can be summarized in three main points. Firstly, nationalization was a constant threat hanging over Aramco. By the end of 1951, Iran had completed the nationalization of its oil industry. In 1971, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi nationalized all assets of British Petroleum within Libya. In 1972, the Iraqi government abruptly nationalized consortium enterprises formed by several international oil companies. The author notes that Aramco was, in fact, fortunate. Despite multiple waves of nationalization sweeping through oil-exporting nations, Saudi Arabia had not yet taken the step of compulsory nationalization. While Saudi Arabia repeatedly declared its opposition to nationalization, it continued to employ this as a bargaining tool with the Americans. The second reason was the growing influence of the OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, alliance of oil-exporting nations. In 1960, petroleum exporting nations Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela founded OPEC. OPEC member nations effectively controlled 80% of the world's oil exports. The influence of the OPEC alliance was relatively weak from 1960 to 1970. A key reason was that the United States could meet growing demand by increasing domestic oil production until around 1970. However, by 1970, oil production in Texas, a major oil field in the U.S., began to decline, while global demand continued to rise. At this point, only OPEC member nations could meet global oil demand, with Saudi oil becoming highly sought after by oil-importing nations. Changes in supply and demand altered the balance of power. In 1971, OPEC successfully negotiated a price increase of 35 cents per barrel in crude oil prices with international oil companies. This small but significant victory marked the first successful negotiation for OPEC as an industry alliance. Success continued. In October 1973, OPEC unilaterally decided to increase crude oil prices by 70%, raising prices to $5.11 per barrel without consulting international oil companies. Both oil companies and oil-importing nations were powerless against this decision. The third reason was the ongoing regional instability. In 1971, the UK, which had operated in the Middle East for over a century, announced its complete withdrawal. Subsequently, in 1973, war broke out between Israel and Arab countries such as Egypt and Syria in the Fourth Middle East War. The situation became increasingly chaotic. Although Saudi Arabia consistently emphasized that interests were more important than regional or ethnic affinities, they were also skillfully using political turmoil to expand their influence. During the height of the war, Saudi Arabia announced production cuts and a complete ban on oil exports, targeting countries such as the United States, the Netherlands, and Portugal. The 1973 oil crisis directly triggered a global economic crisis. For Aramco and the U.S. government behind it, the potential threat of Saudi nationalization was ever present. The increasingly powerful OPEC alliance and the Saudi state were gradually gaining the upper hand. Despite Aramco's substantial profits, from an objective perspective, they were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain these profits. Moreover, transferring ownership shares was not necessarily a losing proposition. This also brings us to internal reasons. The author mentions a possible reason: Aramco's concession agreement with Saudi Arabia was set to expire in 1993. From Saudi Arabia's proposal to purchase shares in 1972 to the completion of the acquisition by the Saudi government in 1980, this process took 8 years. Even if they had waited a few more years, the expiration of the concession agreement was not far off. Rather than waiting for the agreement to expire, it made sense to cash in early. While no one has disclosed the exact amount Saudi Arabia paid to acquire the company, the New York Times mentioned in a report that Saudi Arabia paid between $1.5 billion and $2 billion. If this figure is accurate, and given the unfavorable external environment at the time, Aramco's parent company had no reason to refuse. Moreover, even after transferring ownership to Saudi Arabia, the parent company of Aramco could continue to purchase oil from Saudi Arabia, maintain business relations with the Saudi government, and still do business together. From obtaining full ownership in 1980 to the retirement of the last American CEO of Aramco in 1988, Aramco fully transitioned into a Saudi entity. In 1988, it was officially renamed the Saudi Arabian Oil Company, commonly known as Saudi Aramco. With full autonomy, Saudi Aramco entered its third phase, the period of independent development. In the 1990s, the Middle East witnessed another outbreak of conflicts. In January 1991, the Gulf War erupted, followed by severe sanctions imposed on Iraq by the United Nations in April of the same year. These events further highlighted Saudi Arabia's position in the oil industry. The then Saudi oil minister, Naimi, admitted that this war helped improve the international image of Saudi Aramco and Saudi Arabia. Subsequently, Saudi Aramco embarked on a comprehensive global strategy by both vertically integrating within the oil industry chain and horizontally expanding its reach worldwide. From a vertical perspective, starting in 1991, Saudi Aramco delved into all aspects of the oil industry chain, covering upstream, midstream, and downstream activities. They continued to explore oil reserves, increasing crude oil production in the upstream sector. In the midstream sector, they built infrastructure for the transportation and processing of crude oil and natural gas. In the downstream sector, they established refineries, petrochemical plants, and expanded product marketing channels, minimizing the impact of oil market fluctuations. From a horizontal perspective, Saudi Aramco shifted its focus globally. In the 1990s, it ventured into oil industries in countries such as South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Saudi Arabia's primary approach involved collaboration with local oil companies, acquiring their shares, establishing joint ventures, and providing them with raw materials. The author points out in the book that providing raw materials to their partners was one of the driving forces behind Saudi Aramco's diversification strategy. For example, in Japan, Saudi Aramco first completed the purchase of a 15% stake in Showa Shell Sekiyu KK in 2004, becoming Japan's largest regional crude oil supplier. Then, in 2010, they further signed an agreement with the Japanese government to provide Japan with strategic crude oil reserve facilities. The book's story only covers up to 2015, but history continues. In 2017, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was officially appointed as the new heir to the throne. The new Crown Prince implemented sweeping reforms, allowing women to drive, opening up tourism visas for foreigners, and launching the Vision 2030 initiative. The goal of Vision 2030 is to achieve non-oil sector revenues, including manufacturing, tourism, and finance, at levels equivalent to oil and natural gas exports by 2030. Simultaneously, the Crown Prince vigorously promoted the initial public offering, IPO, of Saudi Aramco. In December 2019, Saudi Aramco successfully listed on the Saudi Stock Exchange. On the second day of trading, its market value exceeded $2 trillion, briefly surpassing Apple to become the world's most valuable company. After going public, Saudi Aramco's profits continued to set new records for global energy companies. As mentioned at the beginning, its net profit was $161.1 billion in 2022. Reflecting on Saudi Arabia's history and the development of Saudi Aramco, the author analyzes the experiences behind their success. I've summarized these into three aspects. Firstly, Saudi Arabia avoids extreme nationalism. Looking at examples of nationalization in major oil-exporting countries, extreme nationalism often drove away foreign oil companies while simultaneously damaging their own economies. What sets Saudi Arabia apart is that King Abdulaziz legitimized his rule through religion, allowing religious institutions to manage justice, society, and parts of education, while excluding them from politics, economics, foreign policy, and the military. Saudi Arabia also experienced a period with a strongly nationalistic oil minister named Tariqi, who aimed to nationalize Saudi oil assets and Aramco. However, after openly criticizing the royal family, he was immediately dismissed by King Faisal, thus stifling the risk of nationalization in its infancy. Secondly, Saudi Arabia has maintained relatively stable power transitions. Saudi Arabia practices a monarchy with the king overseeing the entire nation. Nearly a century has passed since the founding of Saudi Arabia by King Abdulaziz in 1932, and the country has maintained a relatively stable political situation. In general, the succession of kings and power transitions have been smooth. For instance, after the death of King Abdulaziz in 1953, the power struggle between King Saud and Crown Prince Faisal appeared relatively mild. Their disputes never escalated into a true military conflict. Following this event, the successful King Faisal further reinforced the brother-to-brother succession system, ensuring that future kings would prioritize the Saudi family's greatest interests and long-term goals. Thirdly, in the midst of complex geopolitical disputes, Saudi Arabia has always maintained a delicate balance between the East and the West. They have managed to avoid being drawn into wars and have instead cleverly utilized the increased demand for oil during conflicts to expand their international influence. In summary, whether in the realm of oil or politics, Saudi leaders have followed a gradual and cautious approach over the past century. After listening to this book, do you have any new insights into Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Well, that concludes this book on the Saudi company. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom with practicality to achieve our financial goals and create a better future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.